Welcome to the new episode. Today we have Caroline Wallington. So Caroline is a vibrant and passionate systems ecologist and environmental scientist with both academic training and practical experience. She has a BSc honors degree in botany from UCT, an MSc degree in environmental science, and she's a registered professional natural scientist in ecological science. Love the titles. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you.
Could you tell me a little bit more about what your research has taken you into?
Well, that's an interesting question. You mean all of those past researchers or what I'm doing right now?
I'd like to know what you in the past and what you're doing right now, how it all
fits together. Yeah, it is about, so it started in 2009. So it's been quite a journey. But so now I'm doing my doctorate, my PhD in sustainable development and systems science. But it started off, as you said, in botany. I wanted nothing to do with humans. I wanted to study the environment, the plants, the soils. And but I did up until my honors, and then wanted to get into the working world, did that environmental science degree through WITS part-time, which is the master side, and then eventually decided, I've always wanted to do a PhD, but I wasn't going to just do it for the sake of doing it. And then I found a topic here at Stellenbosch University that I was really, really interested in, looking, and it's every single time it's getting more and more complex, starting off with real disciplinary science and getting interdisciplinary and more transdisciplinary, where I am now. It's a bit of a short answer. I don't know if that satisfies your
It does.
your need.
It does. It's perfect because then you can tie right into how the passion of what you're doing ties into the planetary boundaries. So how have you been able to use that passion for what you did with working with planetary boundaries?
Yeah, so I think the planetary boundaries I've really resonated with them because they've really been around only for the last decade or so. And I think my career in academia or in science has sort of followed a trajectory of complexity of academia anyway, or in its own right, in that we've gotten away from the disciplinary siloed approach. Well, I wouldn't say we've gotten away from it. I think there's a recognition we need to get away from it. There's still a big siloed approach in science, but there's been a paradigm shift in recognizing how interconnected and complex everything is. And that spans from ecology to natural science to medical science, social science, cultural, politics. We can't make sense of our world anymore through the disciplinary approach. And where I went through is that going through, ecology and botany, we then need to bring in the different aspects of people and culture and evolution, and then getting more complex and interested in resilience and complexity science and complexity thinking and social ecological systems. And that's what the planetary boundaries try to do or did do at a planetary level. So it's incredibly groundbreaking work that stepped on the many shoulders of giants to try to figure out what are the most important aspects in our home, on our planet, that keep it hospitable for us. And there's so much to it, and it makes you feel like you really understand and you have something tangible to work with as an environmental and social ecological scientist, and to try to figure out where within this framework you are working within and how you're contributing to it. Yeah.
So you'd say that your work obviously in wetland ecology, and that has helped, how has it shaped your approach to some of the planetary boundaries, particularly fresh water usage?
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting one, because I don't particularly work in wetlands anymore, but when I did, I wasn't aware of planetary boundaries. But wetlands are an amazing sort of micro ecosystem, especially I'm coming from a planetary scale, that you had to, as a wetland ecologist, you can't just, it's a very interdisciplinary discipline. So when you work on EIAs, or if you do it just as a research project, wetlands are the culmination of so many other different things. So it's not just freshwater, it's not just soils, it's not just climate, it's not just geology. It's actually the intersection of all of those, which is, I think I've always loved complex systems. And then, so you just, you go along a journey of what systems you work within. But so from the freshwater side is that, when you do an EIA, you have all environmental impact assessment for any kind of development. You'd have the freshwater specialist and the flora specialist and the fauna specialist and the avifaunal specialist and the frog specialist. And there honestly is up to about 16 different specialists on a project. And I used to constantly fight to say the wetland report I need it to be submitted last, because I need the input from the flora guy. I need the input from the groundwater modeling. I need the hydrology report. And there's a whole bunch, and that's how you make sense of where wetlands are. So I think working in wetlands and wetland ecology, which is a freshwater science, but it is a complex freshwater science, because also it is a huge cultural and social component with wetlands, and that really speaks to this planetary boundary of fresh water. And there's also, I think there's green and blue water in the boundaries. And that the green water speaks a lot to the wetland side, because blue water means it's loose water, like it's in a dam or it's in a river or that kind of thing. Where green water means it's the fresh water that's available, but it's in the roots, it's in the leaves, it's sitting in the soil profile and that kind of thing. So, and that's where often you have expression of wetlands. And in an arid and semi-arid country such as South Africa, your expression of wetlands is not really well understood, because we think, okay, a wetland is where it's wet, right? There must be frogs, and there must be a whole bunch of insects and those kind of things that enjoy wetness. But in fact, depending on we have so many different environments in this country, but depending on where you are, there can be up to 10 times more of that landscape actually wetland, without you as a layman knowing that is a wetland signature. So it's difficult to sometimes explain how wetlands express themselves in different landscapes, because they are so complex, but they are so important, and I think a really big part of the freshwater planetary boundary. And I absolutely love anything to do with wetlands and wetland science.
Can you share an example of your work in land rehabilitation and how it's positively impacted local communities, particularly which planetary boundary you're up against, if you had any challenges with that?
Sure, that's a bit of a tough one, because land rehabilitation is so context specific. And I think a lot of the work I just personally was involved in land rehabilitation was at a phase of a project where they weren't rehabilitating yet, for example. But so it was maybe more theoretically that you're investigating an environment, including the people and the communities and that kind of thing, and standing up for making sure that whatever development comes in, or whether they come in and how they leave, results in that landscape being functional for the people that were there before and will continue to be there afterwards. Whether it's the same people or not, it's irrelevant. It needs to be useful for humans. So I can't think of a particularly good example. I haven't done land rehab for quite a few years now, but it is a very interesting space to be in, that is technically an environmental science, where you have to know the soil type, what seed species to put in there, how to contour it, what would go wrong if you had a 1 in 50-year flood. And now with climate change, we need to know, okay, but a 1 in 50-year flood is generally about 1 in 20 years. So what does a 1 in 100-year flood look like? Will my soil stay intact when that happens? So that's an environmental science, but it needs to be done for the right social and cultural and political maybe reasons. So often land rehabilitation can be unjust, for example, where it's just a tick box exercise and you're thinking, okay, cool, no, I'm landscaping, I'm doing this, but is that land useful to the people who live in the area?
Yeah.
So I suppose the current example that I'm actually involved in is I'm appearing as an expert witness in the court case currently with Consol Mine that is trying to go into the Philippi horticultural area, and because there's a lot of silica resource there for glass making, high quality silica. But so in the Philippi horticultural area, it's really high value agricultural land as well. So their rehabilitation plan is, they're going to actually, unfortunately, so with building sand, you only go to above the groundwater level. So groundwater sort of sits just below surface, depending on where you are, how low or high the groundwater is. And in the Philippi area, there's very, very, very shallow groundwater, which is why it gets flooded at this time of year every year. So I'm sorry, I'm diverting the question here, but there's 2 aquifers in the Philippi area, in the Cape Flats aquifer. There's a really deep one, but then there's also a very shallow one, because there's this thick clay and peat layer that keeps water from filtering down.
Okay.
So when they're going to leave, unfortunately, a big hole if they mine there, and make a dam and recreational area. But so one of my comments to their rehabilitation plan was, I think this is an unethical proposal of land use. Have you done any consideration of would this would be useful to the people post your mining? It's a very small scale, locally led agricultural hotspot, and your proposal is to make a dam and tourist attraction. So it didn't sort of line up. So again, you can have a seemingly simple environmental science or discipline, or even a single planetary boundary, but there's so much more complexity that you need to be cognizant of. And I think biosphere integrity, I think, is one of the main boundaries that will come in with land rehabilitation, because to rehabilitate something that is disturbed is extremely difficult in most circumstances. And there's a big move away from the word restoration. Because to restore something would be to bring it back to its natural condition, right? So there was, okay, you can't say the word restoration. You're rehabilitating it to it could be rehabilitating it to any type of something that's of use. But I think in many contexts we don't give enough cognizance to make it culturally appropriate or just socially useful. It's a tick box exercise. So it's definitely, there's no social things that come into the planetary boundaries as well. So that's also difficult to use that language in planetary boundary work. But it would be biosphere integrity, and degradation of land is one of the top 5 problems we're experiencing now in this decade.
So speaking on the community, if someone like you wasn't in the community to be able to see the issues and give the recommendations, how could a regular community member act on these?
Yeah, I think if you look for it, there are incredible people involved and connected to developmental proposals and those kind of things. I was brought into that case specifically through an NGO that was representing society, the local communities. But I think that there needs to be a desire for people to be more involved in their community, and a cross-pollination between society and researchers or academics. And it is actually quite difficult to do, but it's absolutely necessary. And once you get going, it's perfect. It's a perfect fit. Mm-hmm. You need to move away from these big terminologies that are in these diagrams, which are really, really useful. But as scientists, that needs to be the bare minimum. You need to get your work out there, make it, tick the box of publishing it and getting your peer review process and all that stuff, which is absolutely critical. But then what do you do with that? So I think the author of the Planetary Boundaries, Johan Rockström, is incredibly good at getting into policy. So, and how he made the Netflix documentary was really, it's such an amazing documentary that explains it with incredible footage. But I'm actually not answering your question there, which is, I think maybe shows how potentially difficult it is to answer that question, because there's so few good examples of that happening. Because people are busy, people, whether you're, a single mom, or you're working 3 jobs, or you're working 1 job, to get involved then in the developmental projects that take years. I mean, this case has been going on for 10 years, right? So they started the application process in 2014. So you've got to have a lot of patience, and I think it's also up to environmental and social practitioners to engage better and more meaningfully, and not just tick the box of saying, yes, I did my public participation. It's the tick box, which is basically just the legal requirements of what you need to do to engage the community, and let them know what's happening in their environment, is really not good enough. You have to put an advert in a newspaper, stick a sign up in the area for about a couple of weeks. I'm not going to say exact numbers because I can't remember exactly. But so then you read the public participation reports of all these things, and they say, yes, I did this, and yes, I did this, but we never heard from anyone. And it's also a very top-down approach of, this is the resource. And I don't want to focus too much on that kind of example, but I think there's a lack of understanding, no matter who it is, whether it's a scientist or a miner or whatever it is, or just an environmental practitioner. And I mean, I was one of those people where you come into a community as a graduate and you're there as a wetland specialist, but you've been sent with the team. And you're so excited to do your work, but it takes you a while to realize this is someone else's land. Like, why am I representing them? And that takes a bit of maturity to eventually ask. So I think, I think it's a complex answer that requires everyone to get involved, not just, it's not on community members, individuals, or, it's...
Have you seen any improvements, though, in that regard? Even though it is an old example.
I don't know if I can say, because I'm a little bit out of the, the developmental space, having gotten back into academia the last little while. And even just before that, I was more working in sustainability impact assessments, and I took a sort of semi-life working sabbatical in the low felt. So I'm a little bit out of touch, but on how it's being expressed in real life, but on paper, in policy and those kind of things, it's definitely gotten better. But whether that is coming through for each community, I'm not sure. Like you can go and read the sustainability report, and I don't want to of that company, but then you're the individual ecologist that goes onto the site and actually sees, they're making these claims of being sustainable, but are they taking into consideration, cultural ethics and heritage in this space? So I think sustainability, which planetary boundaries do speak to planetary sustainability, essentially, or resilience. So the easiest way to think of resilience is actually just like sustainability on steroids, right? So because a lot of people know the term sustainability, but resilience is a bit out there, and like, what do you mean? But if you always say South Africans are so resilient. So it's the same meaning, but it's just when it goes into an academic setting, it's like, oh, what do you mean? You know, ecological resilience. But it is a very intuitive term. But both for sustainability and resilience, a lot of cultural nuances don't necessarily come through. So I think we've got to bring that through as individuals. And that's also a difference between things that come out of the global north, you know, sort of the Northern Hemisphere, first world countries, and the color that we can bring in as a third world country. We haven't lost touch with diversity and people and what it means to care for the individual on the land. So now I've gone around in circles. I don't even know what your original question was.
So I was going to say, have you seen the improvements, the integration between the community and on the academic side, with trying to help everybody understand what we are trying to get to?
Yeah, I would say, and like academic side, yes. I mean, I think yes. I think there's a lot more to do though. A lot more. And there's negative parties on both sides. You know, there's plenty case studies where the local community are in the wrong and difficult to work with, and you know, then it completely stales a relationship. And there's many more cases where someone coming into the space is in the wrong, and then that stales a relationship. And conflict resolution then is what it comes down to.
So is there an example you could give of the kind of conflicts that usually come up from the communities not understanding what needs to be done? So I'm saying it in that context, that if someone is listening to this and they might be doing that thing, maybe like, oh, that's something we should avoid.
Yeah. Sure. I would definitely say the biggest problem on both sides is lack of empathy in that. And I think this is a problem now all over the world, in that you want so badly to make your point that you will not listen to the other side. So whether that comes from, you know, the mining engineer presenting also this language that no one understands to a community member, and then a community member just getting angry and responding in a non-conflict resolution way to a question or into a place. Definitely, I think causing chaos doesn't help, no matter who the party it is. We like to cause chaos in this country. You know, it's one of our learned ways to get attention, which has served us so well in some ways, because people don't listen, and eventually you have to shout something out or personally attack someone to get attention. But that will never resolve well, if you know what I mean. It will waste so much money and time and precious resources that we don't really have. But I think definitely getting personal, definitely don't do that. You know, there are so many complicated policies operating at the global, local, and also like the regional level that we as local or community people don't understand. And even though someone is not explaining it to you well, that anger is not helpful, if you know what I mean. So anger is never helpful. It almost seems like this is now about relationships, you know, that kind of. So, but it is. It comes down to people, and this is why I moved away from a strict science of botany or ecology and got into an interdisciplinary science, because it doesn't matter what good science or good intentions you have. If you can't speak to people, if you can't relate to people, it's absolutely meaningless, you know. So, yeah, I don't have any more specific examples than that. If it comes to me, I'll bring it up.
Oh, that was cool. I'm glad you went into the interdisciplinary teams. How do you want to first explain what interdisciplinary teams are, and then how they enhance assessments of social, economic, and environmental impacts?
Yeah, so the terminology is actually, I mean, it's even even for us, we have to constantly remind ourselves what we mean when we use certain words. And so okay, too many thoughts in my head. Let me slow down. All right. So you start off with a discipline, right? I think most people understand you can go and study a certain thing, like accounting is a discipline, botany is a discipline, you know, camera filming is a discipline, you know, I can't think, I'm not even using what is the right terminology.
Yeah.
Clearly, this is not my world.
Yeah, we'll stick to yours. Yeah,
camera
ecology.
Yeah. So, but that has limitations, right? And what we've done as humans over the last 100 to 200 years to suddenly make sense of our world is we then went and compartmentalized everything. It was like, you study this and you study this. And we took a mechanistic approach to understanding our planet and ourselves. And so Professor Rika Presa, whose associate is in the center that I'm on, she's a specialist in complexity. And she says the difference, I'm getting to the answer, I promise, is that when you take a tree is not just the wood, and then if you lay out all the sticks perfectly, and then if you lay out all the leaves, that's a mechanistic approach of understanding how a tree works. You know, and you cut the leaves and you put it there, and you put the roots on that side, and you try to figure out, put it together like a puzzle, like an airplane. That's an airplane is something that is complicated, but it's not complex. So, and I'll bring in the complexity stuff because that's why interdisciplinary started to be needed, because then we realize we can't understand our systems, ourselves, and our planet by this mechanistic, keep in your silos, you know, academics don't talk to each other, government departments don't talk to each other, you have your mandate and that's what you do. We're seeing the ramifications of that kind of way of being now. And so what interdisciplinary means is that you're bringing together different disciplinary people, but in a meaningful and engaging way that it becomes, you are now an interdisciplinary person or a team. Like you can, as interdisciplinary professors are now a thing, right? So, which is still quite new. There's also, in between those two is transdisciplinary, which just means you're bringing together, you're getting the different departments together, and you have, you know, a meeting or two, and you can share outputs, but you're still sort of sitting in your disciplines. Whereas interdisciplinary means you really actually are coming together and acting as a unit. Yeah, I think that answers. So then that explains interdisciplinary well.
Yes. So then how is it in enhanced assessments of social, economic, and environmental impacts? Before we even get there, would that make sense to think of them that way, like how the social, economic, and environmental impacts come together in those, or would they be separate?
What do you mean in those?
So you were saying that the way that you guys do it, the ecology, so everyone does their things, and then there's the middle ones that can jump into other disciplines, but sometimes you stay within those. So within these boundaries and those boundaries, does it make sense to go into disciplinary, or would you stick to just
within the planetary boundaries?
Yeah. How has it worked in that?
You know, all of it's important. We will not understand climate change without extremely disciplined climate scientists. We will not understand how much fresh water is still available without multitude of very, very specialist scientists. So you need the full spectrum. And whereas an interdisciplinary scientist would be able to look at the whole picture and explain it and put it into context of what that means for decision makers and policy and people living on the ground. You know, whereas a climate modeler, he needs or she needs to sit and understand the extremely detailed coding. And that's fine. Keep them focused on that. Whereas then you possibly have a bunch of other people that connect that to water and they're modeling that. And then there's some people that go even further and they're modeling water and climate and plant use and transpiration and flow of water through multiple different aspects of the landscape. But then, so it's almost when you try and define terms, we like to get stuck into, the boundary of the term. But most things are actually a spectrum, right? And there's fuzziness between them. So there's definitely deep disciplinary work that brings the planetary boundaries into light. But it's the interdisciplinary approaches that will make it useful to society, I think.
You're going to go to complexity thinking.
Right.
Yeah, you got to make it. So can we break down complexity thinking and then we'll reference it back to...
So complexity is I'll try to do it justice, but also be short in that it's completely linked to what we were just chatting about, but being disciplinary through the spectrum to interdisciplinary, and then transdisciplinary. Yes, transdisciplinary is it's towards the end. Okay. I was incorrect saying it was in the middle. There's another one in the middle. So it's interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary is the next one. Anyway, that's sort of irrelevant for now. But the complexity thinking is the same process of moving away from a mechanistic approach and understanding that the sum is more the
parts are bigger than the whole.
Yeah, the whole is more than the sum of the parts.
Yes.
Right, thanks. So you cannot understand how a tree in a tropical forest works by going in there and counting the number of leaves, counting how many root hairs it has. Not that that's even possible, but making the circumference of its bark, its trunk. That's going to give you what a tree is made up of, but it's not going to tell you how the tree works. So it's a very crude example, but it's an example of how, and I think it's called Newtonian as well. So when Newtonian physics came out, and it was trying to find the absolute laws of nature, and that filtered into how we do science and describe our world. But complexity theory has come across all different disciplines now and interdisciplinary science to make sense that we're not simply living in a mechanistic world. You can't explain someone's emotions through logic, for example. So it's the difference. An easy way to understand also that complexity is different from how something is complicated in that. So engineers, for example, mechanical engineers work in a very complicated science, but it is not a complex science because you can take a plane or a car completely apart into its components and put it right back. So it's highly complicated and difficult work, but there's a right place for every single piece that needs to be in its place. Whereas complex systems and complex thinking is that why things are more than the sum of its parts is that because when you put the pieces of a system together, they don't just sit there and do their job. They interact and they engage and they do all kinds of unpredictable things. You can't predict how a system will behave. And so you'll see the term emergent in a lot of complexity science thinking, is that basically emergence means an unpredictable behavior. So if you put a bunch of people together, you can't predict what the outcome, for example. And we've been doing a couple 100,000 years of humans in this environment. And the interconnections between the systems components basically are what make it complex and not complicated.
Okay, so what role does complexity thinking play in managing and conserving our natural and cultural worlds?
So, an absolutely crucial role now. So, in this whole move away from understanding life or our planet or how we interact with our planet or conserve anything as a simple simple thing. Like I said, we've tried to be mechanistic about our approach to living on this planet and with each other. So the thinking in the way you approach what you define as biodiversity or cultural diversity has a huge impact on how you want to conserve it. So if you're understanding, well, so let me just explain it as in how conservation has changed in that, and how we see nature. And I'd say in the 1900s, this is going to be a very crude summary or example, but we saw nature as outside of ourselves, but still important. So there's a bunch of really interesting literature that explains this shift that we've had in how we observe nature. And I'm going to include sort of cultural heritage and natural heritage in the conservation of nature, because we are part of nature, but that's where we've gone to. But where we came from, at least from the colonial heritage of conservation, was that we want to separate systems out. We want to mine there, we want to build houses here, we want to farm here, and we're going to conserve over there for hunting. We want animals to be over there. Yeah. So again, that's a very mechanistic, siloed approach, everything in its place. Even with, if you want to go back to water management just really quickly, is when we did have the settlers and the colonial powers come into South Africa. They came from the Netherlands and the European sides where there was plentiful water, and they didn't understand that we were a semi-arid country. And so what they did is they came here and they thought, we need to control all this water. We need to put in canals. We need to put in weirs. We need to do all of these things. They straightened our rivers, and put concrete in places, because everything must be in its place. So whereas we take it for granted that that's the really bad place that we've come from, whereas now we're starting to understand the nuances, and that you can't just have a protected area with a fence around it and say that we're protecting biodiversity. Because first of all, that has never protected cultural diversity. We forcibly removed people from conservation areas. So then that's also been a lesson between looking at how simply you want to conserve one thing at a time. So complexity thinking has allowed decision makers and scientists and policy makers and everyone in the community and the society who has gotten involved to realize there's a bigger picture, and that you can't have a government department or a first world NGO come in, pay for a fence, pay for some species to be relocated. I'm specifically focusing on the natural side, and think that that is conservation. So there's been a complete redefining of what we mean by conservation. So it's been very, very interesting over the last, I would say, 1 to 2 decades on how we have changed what we see as conservation, and also from a African perspective and a Southern African perspective, we're trying to move away from this first world way of saying this is how you conserve properly, because we're funded by so many of their organizations. So we have to report back to them and say, yeah, we moved 13 rhino and 17 endangered frogs were saved, and that's all very important. But again, it has often come at the exclusion of the social or cultural heritage. So you cannot conserve both social and natural heritage without complexity thinking.
So within your sphere of influence, how do you feel you can impact the planetary boundaries?
Yeah, I'll speak for myself only, I suppose, first, but then in general. But there's so many ways. I think it's just to not be lazy, get involved. I've always been on a society of some kind, and that gets you involved in different things with different people and exposed to different ways of being. And I say that because whilst that's not directly linked to understanding a planetary boundary, for example, that gets you into the context of the people in your environment, the people you're working with. Like, what are the problems that they're dealing with? And a planetary boundary is almost intangible. Well, it is intangible because it's at the planetary scale. We, as single little humans, can barely understand the national scale. I mean, that's even a region, a province is even too big to think about. So, I mean, it takes teams of people to understand different scales. So I think it's useful to imagine that every single minuscule local scale boundary adds up to the planetary boundary, right? So how they've defined those boundaries is by understanding the local scale. They haven't just used planetary scale information. It's bringing it all down, but then their mandate was to define it at a planetary scale, because that's the scale of our crisis. Mm-hmm. But the scale of action happens locally, you know, with your team and with your people and with your family. So, I think laziness and apathy is the number one reasons people just don't want to get involved in things. And it takes effort, you know, and it takes discipline to get up and, you know, doing this kind of thing. I mean, this is doing something about bringing planetary boundaries to, you know, the local and layman scale. But engaging with specific aspects of the planetary boundaries. I mean, here in the Western Cape, we know we need to save water. I mean, so that's some of the basic ones is save water, you know, don't waste unnecessarily. If you want to think ahead of where we want to be, like do a futuring of what kind of world you want to live in and behave like you're already in that world, if you know what I mean. So it's really difficult often to bring up diet with people, but your food choices and your drink choices and your lifestyle choices are really important. Like I've been vegetarian since I was 12, I think. But now I don't call myself a vegetarian. I call myself an ecovore. Okay. Because I'm technically, also these terms can be dismissive of people. And I remember someone once saying to me when I was still in school, like, you're the nicest vegetarian I've ever met. And I was like, what are you on about? You know, and it's because people latch onto something and they think it becomes part of their ego. You know, like, I'm better than you. I'm a vegetarian. How, you know? So I think I've just luckily never had that problem, but it is still, it's a massive part of my life and in my personal engagement with, and you can say with planetary boundaries, because it's the planet. But I do eat venison. In this country, it's the most ethical form of animal protein, at least in our subcontinent, if you think about it. So, I mean, there's so much to break down there, but it's not, even in the documentary Planetary Boundaries, they don't necessarily advocate that you have to go to the extreme of anything. The extreme of anything is not going to help. But to be, for example, more plant-based has been scientifically and culturally proven to assist and mitigate climate change. And I think at the local scale, it's also difficult, it's sometimes unfair to talk about how we need to mitigate some of these planetary boundaries that are,
or how we can.
Yeah, you know, because a lot of the reason these planetary boundaries are being breached is not because of our controlled actions. You know, a lot of our country and a lot of similar countries are only newly democratic and only newly in control of our actions. And so that's why there is a lot of push for, you know, the global north to assist in our transition to bring the world back under these planetary boundaries, because whilst it might be unfair, that's irrelevant to the fact that we're in a planetary crisis. So, but then if we take aid from the first world, then are we bound by their definition of development? So it's really important to take ownership of these planetary boundaries, because or whatever it means in our local scale boundaries, because if we're not, we will then be developing by someone else's standards, and we need to do it from an African way of life. We've been developed by non-Africans in this continent for our entire history. So there's a big pull to say, no, what do we define as development as Africans? And Africa is a massive, massive continent, and even within South Africa, we have extreme diversities of what that means. So you can't think about development without taking into consideration, and the topic of this, let's say, is planetary boundaries. So when you want to build a mine, when you want to build your house, when you want to fight for rights of someone, how you should always be asking, well, ideally, it would be great if everyone could be asking, I'm fighting for this or I'm doing this, but how does it negatively or positively impact on these boundaries? And think of it in the local scale. So I think in the planetary boundaries, it might have changed now, but for a long time, freshwater use was still in the green area. It was approaching the orange. It wasn't in the red, but it was almost, and from a Southern African perspective, we're way in the red. Our freshwater use is completely unsustainable. I mean, if you just look at the numbers of South Africa, I think the volumes of water that our incredible people calculate and then dish out the numbers of, you're allowed this megaliters, you can take that megaliters. They dish out more water than there is in the country. So it doesn't make sense. So I think equity and a just future would bring a lot of interest from people into the planetary boundaries. While I say there's not a big social component in there. They are defined in order to allow social and cultural sustainable development. So whilst they are an environmental boundary, they're meaningless for them. The environment doesn't care. It will regenerate, it will change. But why we're defining them is for the social decision makers. So yeah, I think no matter any decision you make, there's a footprint. There's always going to be an impact. So there's so many different ways, and it's up to you to bring that into your life. Surround yourself with inspiring people that are interested in this. Get involved with people that are working on this and not apathetic to the problems that our country has and our planet. Because we are, sorry, just to say one more thing, as South Africa and Southern Africa, is that we are warming at double the rate of the global warming. So when we talk about a 1.5 degree warming, double that for what it means in South Africa and Southern Africa. It's basically from up to Botswana is the hotspot that is the real doubling, and it sort of expands out from there.
If you were in a teaching capacity, how would you relay these planetary boundaries to the layman?
I think getting out into nature, even if it's in an urban setting, you cannot you can understand it on paper, but I think also explaining to people that it's a journey to understand all the different systems that make our planet up. It's not intuitive, but it's intuitive and more understanding on a smaller local scale. So going out to a project site or going out for a week-long even escapade with a bunch of students. I think I would try and explain the theory without using the theoretical words, I would imagine. So
how would you do it?
And it's maybe going into the Philippi horticultural area, for example. That's just the case that's on top of my mind. I'm sure there's many more that I could better think of. But, and saying, where do you think this water comes from? Or why is this water polluted? Because there's a huge problem with polluted water there. And I think, I'm technically still a millennial. I was born in 89, but I don't really resonate with the millennial way of life. I have older brothers, so I think I was buffered a lot by them. But I think these next generations are even this third world are disconnected from what it means, how they interconnect all these different systems. So getting away from the cell phone and the classroom and getting into a project site, getting into the nuances of a project and who has to make decisions on that information and what decision would you make? Bringing them into the whole picture of something and not just doing a disciplinary approach of, okay, we're just going to go look at grasses, or we're just going to go look at, going to go interview people or something like that. Yeah, I don't know. I think, and it would be anything that inspires interest, and they're not that out there. We actually live in each planetary boundary. This is a diagram and a theory, and well, it's not even a theory, it's a scientific framework, but it's trying to explain daily living. So in a way, it detaches from us, but it's trying to explain our everyday living. So I would ask that exact question to students and see what they would come up with, and maybe draw it, maybe bring an art or performance. Don't explain it with words. Maybe, it's difficult until you learn a certain set of words, and sometimes you can get stuck on a set of words like scientists do, and we answer questions with very difficult big words, and because that's what we know. And this is what transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary science means. It's like, how can we understand it better? Like, can you show what you mean in an artwork or in a play or in a poem? Or like, so there's a push for graphical abstracts. So when you submit a paper, you don't just have your abstract that is the summary of your work. You produce a graphic version of it.
So all actions have consequences. So when you're out in nature, would you be explaining the differences of, if you do this thing, this will happen?
Yeah, I think that really is a huge thing to get, and that reminds me back of your question on, what would I say to communities or different people that get involved in a negative way or an unhelpful way in their voice. And I think that's because we don't understand the ramifications of each decision for the bunch, because we like simplicity. We like the mechanistic approach because it's helpful for us to understand life like that. But a decision here has really big influences, not necessarily big, but it has influences in things that you can't even see, right? So, and that's actually where my doctoral research is going into. So again, maybe we'll see if there's time for that later, but to answer the question in that, and I think that's where mining is a very fruitful case study for a lot of these challenges, because even now for the green revolution, or to become a green economy energy-wise, the platinum group metals and rare earth metals are exceptionally needed. Lithium mining is gone crazy. There's a bunch of rare earth metals that sit in the batteries of the wind turbines and those kind of things. So everything has an impact. And I think that's a very humbling thing to learn, and to minimize that impact is obviously the ideal approach. But I think it's also to respect that a decision to do something here and not there may seem positive to you in this light, but you could be negatively impacting someone in a faraway location that you have no idea about. So, for example, like this Philippi mine, in that if they do not mine this area, which employs lots of people in farming, and it's a cultural area, like there's lots of reasons not to mine there. But let's say they don't, the silica plant might have to close down, which means all of those people lose their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So, and this is where we need to have good decision makers in places of power, because we are all here as laymen or scientists coming together and throwing all these complex pieces of the puzzle, and it's up to the decision makers to try and decide whose going to benefit more than someone else, for example. So yeah, I think to realize that there is always impact is very, very, very important. I think there's almost like 60 or 70% of the periodic table of elements in iPhones. So if you're using technology, there is a big hole in the ground somewhere providing that for you. You know, I went to one of the biggest gold mines in the world in West Africa, and it is an enormous, you cannot understand how big that hole in the ground is. And they mine ounces of gold. I mean, tiny little pieces of gold to tons and tons and tons of rock. So, I mean, if you're wearing gold jewelry, I remember seeing like there's a lot of ores, but you have this waste. They do like a bar chart and say, this is much waste, this much stuff you get out of, right?
Yeah.
So, where is that sitting? And was that gold ethically extracted from the people and that kind of thing? So most of the time it is, but there is major impact with every decision, and our challenge is, now that we know a lot of this complex stuff and these planetary boundaries, and we know that the decisions that have led us into the state of planetary boundaries and everything else that sits below it that supports those findings, how can we make different decisions?